At 3:14 in the afternoon, on August 17, 1944, Sergeant Harold Pemberton stood outside the wire fence of Camp 186 near Winchester, Hampshire, watching 5 German prisoners board an army lorry. He had been a guard for 11 months. He had processed 847 prisoner arrivals. He had broken up 23 fights. He had confiscated 156 contraband items. He had stopped 4 escape attempts. And now he was taking enemy soldiers to see Stonehenge because a Ministry of War directive said it would improve morale and demonstrate British cultural superiority. Harold thought the directive was the stupidest thing he had read since joining the army. These men had bombed London, they had killed British soldiers, and he was supposed to take them sightseeing. The guard who helped load the prisoners was Private Thomas Whitmore from Dover. Thomas had been assigned to Camp 186 since its opening in September 1943. He had watched German prisoners arrive in batches of 50 or 60. He had supervised their work details in the fields. He had listened to them sing German songs in the evenings, and he had developed a theory that all Germans were fundamentally incapable of appreciating anything that wasn't efficient or militaristic. Thomas told Harold that taking Germans to Stonehenge was a waste of petrol. They would look at ancient stones and calculate load-bearing capacity. They would see history and think only about engineering. Harold agreed. But orders were orders. Camp 186 held 412 German prisoners of war in August 1944. Most had been captured in France after D-Day. Wehrmacht infantry, experienced soldiers who had fought across Normandy. They had surrendered to British and Canadian forces between June and July 1944, been processed through temporary camps in France, then shipped to England and distributed among detention facilities across the country. Hampshire received more than most counties because the farms needed labour. Harvest season, fruit picking, vegetable crops. The prisoners were not required to work under Geneva Convention rules, but most volunteered because the alternative was sitting in barracks with nothing to do. The pay was 6 pence per day in camp tokens. The tokens could be used at the camp canteen to buy cigarettes, soap, writing paper, chocolate. The prisoners could not believe any of it was genuine. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter had been at Camp 186 since July 1944. Before the war, he had been a schoolteacher in Munich, mathematics and physics. He had been drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1940. He had fought in Belgium, then France. The British captured him near Caen on July 12th after his unit was surrounded by Canadian infantry. Klaus spent 2 weeks in a field camp in Normandy before being transported to England. He arrived at Camp 186 expecting harsh treatment, limited rations, physical labour as punishment. Instead, he found a camp with a library, a football pitch, evening lectures on British history, and 3 meals a day that included bread and meat. Klaus did not trust it. He had been trained to recognise enemy psychological tactics. The British were trying to weaken German resolve by creating an artificial environment of normalcy. The food was probably the minimum required by international law. The educational programs were certainly designed to indoctrinate prisoners with Allied propaganda. The newspapers available in the camp library were obviously censored to present false information about the war's progress. Klaus organised a discussion group among the prisoners. Not a formal resistance committee, just informal conversations about camp conditions and British methods. 8 men attended regularly. They met in the corner of the recreation hall after dinner, speaking quietly in German. They analysed everything the British provided, looking for hidden meanings and manipulation techniques. In early August, a guard posted a notice on the bulletin board. The notice announced that selected prisoners would be permitted to visit historical sites in the surrounding area as part of a cultural education programme. The first trip would be to Stonehenge on August 17th. 5 prisoners would be chosen based on good behaviour and work performance. Klaus's discussion group examined the notice carefully. They concluded it was obviously a propaganda exercise. The British wanted to impress German prisoners with England's ancient monuments to suggest British civilization was superior to German culture. Klaus believed this revealed British insecurity. If Britain were actually winning the war, they would not need to take prisoners on sightseeing trips to prove their cultural importance. The group decided that if any of them were selected for the trip, they should attend but remain emotionally detached. They should observe the stones as geological specimens, nothing more. They should not give the British the satisfaction of appearing impressed. Klaus was selected. The camp commander, Major Richard Thornton, announced the names on August the 15th. 5 prisoners: Klaus Richter, Ernst Weber, Friedrich Braun, Josef Keller, and Martin Schaefer. All had maintained clean, disciplinary records. All had volunteered for work details. All spoke at least basic English. Major Thornton explained the trip would depart at 1500 hours on August the 17th. The prisoners would travel by lorry with an escort of 2 guards. They would spend 1 hour at Stonehenge. They would return to camp by 1800 hours. Any prisoner who attempted to escape would be shot. The trip began on schedule. Klaus and the 4 other prisoners climbed into the back of an army lorry at 1500 hours. Sergeant Pemberton and Private Whitmore sat in the front. The lorry drove south from Winchester towards Salisbury Plain. The journey would take approximately 45 minutes. Klaus sat in the back of the lorry, watching the Hampshire countryside pass by. Green fields, stone walls, sheep grazing on hillsides. It looked nothing like the propaganda images of war-torn Britain he had seen in German newsreels. The farms appeared productive. The roads were maintained. The villages showed no signs of bombing damage. Klaus reminded himself this was probably a carefully selected route designed to create false impressions. Ernst Weber sat next to Klaus. Ernst was 28 years old. He had been a factory worker in Stuttgart before the war. He had been drafted in 1941. He had fought in North Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps before being transferred to France in early 1944. The British captured him during the Normandy campaign on June 27th. Ernst had spent 6 weeks at Camp 186. Ernst had told Klaus during one of their discussion group meetings that he did not care about propaganda or British tactics. He just wanted the war to end so he could go home. But Ernst also admitted he did not believe the war would end with German victory. Klaus had warned Ernst that defeatist thinking was exactly what the British wanted to create. The lorry reached Salisbury Plain at 1545 hours. The landscape changed. Fewer trees, more open grassland, rolling hills that stretched to the horizon. Private Whitmore pointed ahead through the windscreen. Klaus could see something in the distance. Dark vertical shapes against the pale sky. The stones. The lorry drove closer. The shapes became more distinct. A circle of massive standing stones, some topped with horizontal slabs, others standing alone. The structures appeared impossibly large even from a distance of half a mile. Klaus felt something unexpected. Not curiosity exactly, but something close to it. A question forming in his mind before he could stop it. How? The lorry parked near the stone circle at 1554 hours. Sergeant Pemberton opened the back of the lorry and told the prisoners to climb out. Klaus stepped down onto the grass. The stones were 200 feet away. Up close, they were even larger than they had appeared from the road. Each vertical stone stood approximately 13 feet tall. The stones weighed several tons at minimum. Klaus could see tool marks on the surfaces, shaping marks, evidence of deliberate construction. The horizontal stones balanced on top of pairs of vertical stones formed a continuous ring. Some sections had collapsed, leaving gaps. Other sections remained intact after what must have been thousands of years. Private Whitmore walked toward the stones. He had visited Stonehenge 3 times before as a guard escort. He expected the same reaction he always saw from prisoners. Initial interest, then gradual boredom, as they realized the stones were just stones, ancient but ultimately purposeless. Thomas had once brought a group of Italian prisoners to Stonehenge. They had spent most of the visit smoking cigarettes and talking among themselves. Thomas expected the Germans to be even less impressed. Germans valued precision and function. These stones had neither. Klaus approached the nearest stone. The surface was rough, weathered by centuries of rain and wind. Lichens grew in patches of green and orange. Klaus reached out and touched the stone. It was cold, solid. Absolutely real. Klaus walked around the stone, examining it from all sides. The base was wider than the top, tapered slightly for stability. The shaping was crude by modern standards but effective. Someone had understood engineering principles. Someone had calculated weight distribution. Someone had planned this construction with mathematical precision. Klaus asked in English how old the stones were. Sergeant Pemberton had been briefed on Stonehenge before the trip. The camp education officer had provided him with basic facts. Harold did not care about ancient history, but he could recite information when required. He told Klaus the stones were approximately 4,000 years old. Some estimates suggested older. The large stones, called sarsens, had been transported from quarries 20 miles away. The smaller blue stones had come from Wales, over 150 miles distant. No one knew exactly how the builders had moved stones weighing up to 25 tons without modern equipment. Klaus did the calculation in his head. 4,000 years ago. Bronze Age. Before Rome. Before Greece. Before any civilization Klaus had learned about in school. People who should have been primitive, barely beyond stone tools and animal skins, had moved 25-ton rocks across 20 miles of countryside and erected them in precise geometric patterns. Klaus looked at Ernst. Ernst was standing motionless, staring at the stones with an expression Klaus had never seen before. Not detachment, not boredom. Something closer to awe. Friedrich Braun walked into the center of the stone circle. Friedrich was 32 years old. He had been an architect in Berlin before the war. He had designed residential buildings, calculated structural loads, specified materials. Friedrich understood construction. He stood in the center of the circle and turned slowly, looking at each stone. The spacing was irregular but intentional. The tallest stones aligned with specific positions. Friedrich remembered reading something about Stonehenge years ago, something about astronomical alignments. Summer solstice, winter solstice. The stones marked celestial events. Friedrich asked Sergeant Pemberton if this was true. Harold confirmed it. The main axis of the stone circle aligned with the sunrise on the summer solstice. Thousands of people gathered at Stonehenge every June 21st to watch the sun rise through the stones. The tradition had continued for decades, possibly centuries. Harold added that the camp education officer had mentioned other alignments too. Moon phases, equinoxes, mathematical relationships between stone positions. The builders had encoded astronomical knowledge into the structure. Friedrich sat down on the grass inside the stone circle. He put his head in his hands. Josef Keller asked if Friedrich was feeling ill. Friedrich said he was fine. He was just thinking. He was thinking about how much knowledge had existed 4,000 years ago. How people without writing, without mathematics as he understood it, without metal tools, had looked at the sky and understood patterns, had tracked the sun and moon with enough precision to build permanent markers, had organized labor and resources to move 25-ton stones, had created something that lasted 4,000 years. Friedrich said quietly in German that the 1,000-year Reich was a stupid name. Germany could not even win a 6-year war. Private Whitmore heard the tone in Friedrich's voice, even though he did not understand the German words. Thomas had expected bored Germans calculating structural engineering. Instead, he was watching grown men sit on the ground looking at rocks with expressions that reminded Thomas of how he had felt the first time he saw Dover's white cliffs after returning from France. That feeling of recognizing something important, something that connected you to a place and a history larger than yourself. Thomas realized with uncomfortable clarity that these men were having the same experience he had when he had visited Stonehenge on his own time before the war. They were not calculating, they were feeling. Klaus walked around the entire circle, examining each stone. He found evidence of careful planning everywhere. The stones were placed to create specific sight lines. The fallen stones showed how the structure had deteriorated, but also revealed the original construction methods. Mortise and tenon joints. The horizontal stones had been shaped with protruding knobs that fit into carved sockets on the vertical stones. Bronze Age people had invented joinery. Klaus had assumed joinery was a medieval innovation. He had been wrong. He asked Sergeant Pemberton if archaeologists knew who built Stonehenge. Harold said no one knew. The builders left no written records, no names, no inscriptions, no explanation of purpose beyond what could be inferred from the structure itself. The people who built Stonehenge had disappeared into history, leaving only the stones. Their civilization was gone. Their language was lost. Their daily lives were unknown. But the stones remained. Harold added that this was what made Stonehenge important to British people. It proved that people had lived on this island for thousands of years, had built things that lasted, had looked at the same sky and tried to understand it. Ernst Weber was crying, not sobbing, just tears running down his face. Klaus asked what was wrong. Ernst said nothing was wrong. He was just understanding something for the first time. He was understanding that nations were temporary. Germany was temporary. Britain was temporary. The war was temporary. But some things lasted longer than nations. Some achievements mattered more than military victories. The people who built Stonehenge were forgotten, but their work remained. Ernst wondered what would remain of Germany in 4,000 years. He wondered if anyone would remember the Wehrmacht or the Luftwaffe or the grand plans for European conquest. Probably not. But these stones would still be standing. Martin Schaefer had been silent since arriving. Martin was 26 years old. He had been a university student in Heidelberg, studying history before the war ended his education. Martin had been drafted in 1942. He had fought in France and been captured on August the 3rd during the Allied advance. Martin stood at the edge of the stone circle looking outward across Salisbury Plain. The landscape was empty except for grass and sky. No buildings visible for miles, no roads except the small track the lorry had used. Martin imagined what this place looked like 4,000 years ago. Probably similar. Same grass, same sky, different people. People who had reasons for building Stonehenge that made sense to them. People who had gathered here for ceremonies or observations or purposes no modern person could fully understand. Sergeant Pemberton checked his watch. 1640 hours. They had been at Stonehenge for 45 minutes. The directive specified 1 hour maximum. Harold had planned to leave at 1700 hours, allowing 15 minutes for the prisoners to finish looking around. But watching these men react to the stones was making Harold uncomfortable. Not because they were behaving badly, because they were behaving exactly like Harold had behaved the first time he visited Stonehenge with his father in 1932. Harold had been 14 years old. His father had explained the history, the theories about construction, the astronomical alignments. Harold had felt something shift in his understanding of time and human achievement. He was watching the same shift happen in these German prisoners. Private Whitmore approached Klaus and Ernst. Thomas asked in careful English if they had questions about Stonehenge. Klaus said he had many questions, but understood Thomas probably did not have answers. Klaus asked if British people learned about Stonehenge in school. Thomas said yes. Every British child learned about Stonehenge, usually around age 10 or 11. Part of national history, part of understanding Britain's past. Klaus nodded. He said German children learned about the Roman Empire and Greek civilization, but rarely about anything older. Germany's history felt short compared to this. Thomas said 4,000 years made everyone's personal history feel short. Friedrich stood up and walked to the outer edge of the circle. He took a small notebook from his pocket. The guards had permitted prisoners to bring notebooks and pencils on the trip for sketching or notes. Friedrich began drawing the stone circle from memory, marking approximate dimensions and positions. He wanted to remember the proportions, the spacing, the relationships between elements. He wanted to understand how the builders had achieved structural stability without modern techniques. Harold watched Friedrich draw. The sketches were precise, almost architectural. Harold asked if Friedrich was an engineer. Friedrich said he had been an architect before the war. Harold mentioned that many of the stones had fallen over the centuries, but the remaining structures were stable. Friedrich said that was the remarkable part. True engineering did not rely on temporary solutions. It created permanence. Joseph Keller walked to one of the trilithons, the structures where two vertical stones supported a horizontal stone. The horizontal stone weighed approximately 7 tons, according to Sergeant Pemberton's briefing notes. Joseph was 30 years old. He had been a carpenter in Hamburg. Joseph understood wood and joinery, but had never worked with stone. Joseph examined the mortise and tenon joint, where the horizontal stone rested on the vertical stone. The fit was tight, despite 4,000 years of weathering. Joseph said in German that whoever designed this joint understood materials better than many modern carpenters. The joint accounted for stone's properties. No metal fasteners, no adhesives, just shaped stone fitting together through gravity and friction. The hour ended at 16:54 hours. Sergeant Pemberton announced it was time to return to the lorry. The 5 prisoners walked slowly back across the grass. Klaus turned back twice to look at the stones. Each time, they appeared different. The light was changing as afternoon shifted toward evening. Shadows moved across the stone surfaces. Klaus realized the stones would look different at every hour of the day, different with every season, different with every weather condition. The builders had created something that changed constantly while remaining permanent. The drive back to Camp 186 was quiet. The prisoners sat in the back of the lorry without speaking. Private Whitmore expected them to discuss what they had seen, to analyze and categorize. Instead, they were silent. Thomas glanced back through the rear window of the lorry cab. Klaus was looking out at the countryside with an expression Thomas recognized, the expression of someone reconsidering assumptions. Thomas had seen that expression on his own face in mirrors after significant experiences. First time seeing the ocean, first time visiting London, first time understanding that the world was larger and older than his personal experience. The lorry arrived at Camp 186 at 18:43 hours. The prisoners climbed out and returned to their barracks. Sergeant Pemberton filed a brief report with Major Thornton. The trip had proceeded without incident. No escape attempts, no disciplinary issues. The prisoners had spent the allocated hour examining the stones and asking questions about construction and history. Harold did not mention the crying or the sitting on the ground or the expression on Friedrich's face when he realized 4,000 years made the 1,000-year Reich sound absurd. These details seemed personal, not relevant to a military report. Private Whitmore could not stop thinking about the trip. That evening, he wrote a letter to his sister in Dover. Thomas described taking German prisoners to Stonehenge. He described their reactions. He wrote that he had expected them to be cold and analytical, but instead they had responded with something closer to reverence. Thomas wrote that watching enemy soldiers experience the same emotion he had felt at the same place had made him uncomfortable. Not because they were enemies, because it revealed they were not fundamentally different from him. They recognized beauty. They understood history. They felt small in the presence of something ancient and permanent. Thomas did not mail the letter. He reread it the next morning and decided it sounded confused. Klaus's discussion group met 3 days after the Stonehenge trip. The 8 men gathered in the recreation hall as usual. Klaus expected the others to want to discuss the stones and develop theories about British propaganda tactics. Instead, the conversation kept returning to the same question. What did the stones mean? Not what did the British want the stones to mean? What did the stones actually mean about human civilization and the importance of current political conflicts? Ernst Weber suggested the stones proved nations were less important than people wanted to believe. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted, languages changed. But some human achievements transcended politics. The people who built Stonehenge had created something that outlasted their entire civilization. Ernst wondered aloud if anything the Wehrmacht had done would matter in 4,000 years. Probably not, but Stonehenge would still be standing. Friedrich Braun had a different interpretation. Friedrich argued the stones proved that technical knowledge was not linear. Modern people assumed ancient people were primitive and ignorant, but the builders of Stonehenge had understood mathematics, astronomy, structural engineering, and project management. They had simply expressed that knowledge differently. Friedrich said this meant the Nazis were wrong about racial superiority and cultural evolution. Intelligence and capability existed in all times and all peoples. The idea that Germans were inherently superior to others was ridiculous when ancient Britons could move 25-ton stones without metal tools. The discussion group continued meeting weekly, but the focus changed. Instead of analysing British propaganda tactics, they discussed history and civilization. They read books from the camp library about archaeology and ancient cultures. They asked the guards questions about British historical sites. Major Thornton noticed the change and mentioned it to Sergeant Pemberton. The German prisoners seemed more engaged with educational materials, more curious about English history, less focused on resistance activities. Thornton considered this a positive development. Pemberton agreed, but could not explain why it made him feel strange. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. VE Day. Camp 186 held a celebration for the guards, but not for the prisoners. The German prisoners learned about the surrender through official announcement. Klaus heard the news in the barracks at 14:30 hours. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. Klaus felt relief, not grief. The war had been lost since Stalingrad. Everyone knew it. The official surrender just made it final. The repatriation process began in June 1945. British authorities organised prisoner returns in stages. Priority given to men with families in occupied zones. Klaus was assigned to a transport group scheduled for September 1945. He would return to Germany in approximately 3 months. Klaus used the time to improve his English. He read English newspapers, practiced conversation with guards who were willing to talk, and studied British history. He wanted to understand the country that had defeated Germany. Private Whitmore was transferred to occupation duty in Germany in July 1945. Before leaving, Thomas sought out Klaus. Thomas asked if Klaus wanted any particular books from the camp library to take back to Germany. Klaus said he wanted books about Stonehenge if any were available. Thomas found 2. A general guide to British prehistoric monuments and a more technical text about Neolithic construction methods. Thomas gave both books to Klaus. Klaus asked why Thomas was being generous to an enemy prisoner. Thomas said the war was over. Klaus was not an enemy anymore, just a man going home. Klaus returned to Munich on September 14, 1945. The city was destroyed. Allied bombing had reduced entire neighbourhoods to rubble. Klaus's apartment building no longer existed. His school was damaged beyond repair, food was scarce, housing was scarce, employment was scarce. Klaus spent his first week in Munich at a displaced persons centre. The centre served 1 meal per day, thin soup with bread. Klaus ate the soup and thought about Camp 186. The library, the football pitch, the 3 meals per day with bread and meat. The abundance, that had seemed like propaganda but had been simple reality. Klaus found work as a translator in 1946, English to German for the Allied Occupation Authority. His English had improved during imprisonment, and the occupation needed German-speaking personnel who could work with British and American administrators. Klaus was good at the work because he understood how the British thought. He had spent months studying them, analysing them, trying to determine if they were manipulating him. He had concluded they were not manipulating him. They were simply operating from a baseline of assumptions different from German assumptions. In 1948, Klaus was hired by a British construction company working on reconstruction projects in Bavaria. The company needed someone who understood both German building codes and British engineering practices. Klaus worked as a liaison, translating not just language, but technical concepts and professional expectations. Klaus was effective because he could explain British approaches to German workers and German concerns to British managers. The Stonehenge books he had brought from England helped. When British engineers mentioned historical construction techniques, Klaus could reference examples and demonstrate knowledge. In 1952, Klaus visited England for the first time since repatriation. The construction company sent him to London for a conference on post-war building standards. Klaus had 3 days in England. He used one day to travel to Stonehenge. He took a train from London to Salisbury, then a bus to the Stones. He arrived at 14:30 hours on a clear afternoon. The Stones looked exactly as he remembered from August 1944. Same massive presence, same impossible age, same quiet permanence. Klaus stood at the edge of the stone circle for 37 minutes. Other visitors walked around taking photographs. Families with children, elderly couples, American tourists. Klaus watched them interact with the stones, touching the surfaces, reading informational signs, posing for pictures, casual engagement with something 4,000 years old. Klaus realized this was what had changed his understanding in 1944, not the stones themselves. The British casualness about them. The assumption that ancient monuments were public resources accessible to everyone, including enemy prisoners. The confidence that came from a culture secure enough to share its treasures. Klaus returned to Munich and continued working in construction. He married in 1955. He and his wife had 2 children. Klaus became a technical director for the construction company in 1962. He retired in 1978. Throughout his career, Klaus kept the 2 Stonehenge books Private Whitmore had given him. The books sat on a shelf in his office, visible but rarely discussed. Colleagues occasionally asked about them. Klaus would explain he had visited Stonehenge as a prisoner of war and found it interesting. He did not explain that seeing Stonehenge had changed his understanding of civilization, permanence, and the relative importance of military conflicts. Sergeant Harold Pemberton returned to civilian life in December 1945. Harold resumed his pre-war work as a railway clerk in Winchester. He married his longtime girlfriend in 1946. They had 1 daughter. Harold rarely spoke about his time as a prison guard. When asked about the war, he mentioned administrative duties and routine security work. He did not mention taking German prisoners to Stonehenge. The experience felt too complicated to explain. How could he describe watching enemy soldiers cry while looking at rocks? How could he justify feeling sympathy for men who had fought against Britain? In 1967, Harold took his daughter to Stonehenge for her 18th birthday. She had expressed interest in archaeology and ancient history. Harold stood with her at the stone circle and watched her react to the stones. The same sense of awe he had felt at age 14, the same recognition of something important and permanent. Harold told his daughter about taking German prisoners to Stonehenge in 1944. He described their reactions, the crying, the silence, the careful sketches. His daughter asked if the experience changed how Harold thought about Germans. Harold said it complicated things, made it harder to think of them as simply enemies, made him realize they were people who could appreciate the same things he appreciated. Harold died on January the 22nd, 1989, in Winchester. He was 70 years old. His obituary mentioned his railway career and his service during the war. The obituary did not mention Camp 186 or Stonehenge, or the afternoon he watched German prisoners sit on the grass and reconsider everything they believed about Britain and Germany and the relative permanence of nations. Klaus Richter died on November 8, 1996 in Munich. He was 76 years old. His obituary mentioned his career in construction and his work on post-war reconstruction. At his funeral, one of his children told a story. The story of a German soldier who was taken to Stonehenge as a prisoner and learned that some things last longer than wars. The story of a man who kept 2 books about ancient stones for 51 years because they reminded him that nations rise and fall, but human achievement can transcend politics. The story of a prisoner who became a bridge between cultures because he understood that wonder and reverence are universal human responses to genuine greatness. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about enemies who found common ground. Real people, real transformations. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. United Kingdom, Germany, United States, France. Our community stretches across the entire world. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Klaus Richter and Harold Pemberton don't disappear into silence.